Thanks for hanging on, everybody.
Hello, is my audio sounding clear?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a fuzzy, but I think it's okay. I can hear you.
Okay. Are you sure? Is this fine?
Yeah, I think it's like the computer fan, but it's fine for me.
Hi, my name is Tanner, as you know, and the title of my project is The Sanctuary. So my thesis is a proposal for a church and community center in Jackson, Mississippi. And some of the topics that I've been investigating, both in research and the proposal itself, are largely related to the nuanced relations of divine space and atmosphere. And I found an interest in the spirit of soft architecture and soft light, where individuals may connect to something beyond themselves. There's a focus on light, shadow, transparency, and disjunction, with special emphasis placed on the methods and meanings of representation. So the site is located in the Fair Street Historic District, which is a mixed density area that's in equal proximity to the state capitol, downtown, commercial and residential fabrics, and various parks. This area is the northernmost part of the district, which was once known as the Black Mecca of Mississippi in the 1950s, but is now composed mostly of derelict or abandoned structures due to many years of failed upkeep and investment attempts. This proposal aims to utilize the civic identity of a church, likely to be successful in its bid and building timeline, and create another node in a network of churches in the area with an additional campus of programs that more directly address a diverse community and its needs. So as you can see in the site plan, the proposal is situated at the northwest intersection of the Fair Street Historic District, and the street itself is kind of kissing the block on the right. There are two main structures, the sanctuary at left and the armory at right, which are joined by a secondary in scale monastery along the southernmost section of the site. So this is the armory, the monastery here, and the sanctuary. The ground level plan cuts through all three typologies, and you can see the organization of space from the more familiar sanctuary structure to the more expansively fluid work and exhibition spaces housed within the armory. And the monastery has both living and eating quarters with the various gardens, both walled and freeform, flat and sloped, wrapping up a majority of these structures. And then this is the second level plan cutting through the mezzanine level within the armory. And the proposal progresses in three key phases relating to the three key structures, each with its own set of strategies and interdisciplinary involvement. And this is just a timeline of that, correlating the different phases. And here you can see the fortified street-facing wall of the armory with cantilever deck and a temporal art installation in the central space. And the front elevation with stained glass details and a rose window give glimpses into the strategic lighting of the interior altar, which is immediately behind this doorway and always accessible to the public. The surrounding landscaping provides an ecological atmosphere of serenity and sanctitude. And here's that altar now with different people enjoying the space and its potential meanings. And I guess to go into some more detail, returning to a fuller list of references and inspirations, I'd like to spend a moment on an incredibly inspiring quote, in my view, from Kate Thomas's lecture, Lesbian Arcadia, that finds meaning and matter in my project through the shimmer. Material things are not inert, but instead have shimmer and spark. When we examine the environment, it shimmers and figures emerge in strange distortion, writes Timothy Morton in his Manifesto for Queer Ecology. Shimmer is a word that means the play between shadow and illumination, light that is flickering or tremulous, capable of casting new forms and relation. The garden is not made, but is instead always becoming. It is in flickering motion between hard and soft surfaces, built and planted elements that are always in states of growth and decay. Some elements of the garden will last for centuries, and others for less than a season. Before I had the chance to hear that lecture, though, I began exploring representationally what a slippage of color, light, and cast shadow might begin to look like. I made this image at the start of this design semester before a schematic actually emerged, and kept finding its energy hidden throughout my progress. And the basis for this image came from an interest in movement, both in cinematics and sound. I spatialized the bombastic sounds of Sophie, who is a trailblazing musician and producer, who unfortunately just passed away this year, and extrapolated geometries from the enigmatic shimmer from the film Annihilation. What I found, or I guess kept finding, was meaning in the dimensions and shimmerings of space and their potential relations to identity. And there are five key questions that I've been inspired by and seeking responses to. The question of ethics at the edge, where perforation and activation may begin cross-contaminating towards new horizons, and a question of precedence in terms of siloing discipline and the subversion of power. The question of space, where spatializations of non-binary thought might lead to queered landscapes of ephemeral shimmering. A question of authorship, in which traditional modes of ownership, stewardship, time and design implementation might be challenged, and a question of equity, in which reformation may be explored through moments of sociospatial reclamation and a kind of intentional exclusion. And as I've aimed to answer these broad questions with specificity, I've made arguments for the denouncement of permanence, which embraces the many shifts surrounding design through fluid propositions of nonlinearity. The challenge to binary thinking, which argues for an emphasis on thresholds and gradients instead of harsh lines and static interventions. A hybridization of discipline, which sees diverse potential in the cross-collaboration of unique fields. A reconsideration of authorship, which seeks to expand the definitions of agency by blurring or subverting entirely via adaptive networks of participation. And lastly, a queering of space, in which the unique capabilities of queer theory might intersect with design and become its own distinct methodology that's able to proliferate beyond any single category, identity, or oppression. And in the case of Operation Soap, a series of brutal police raids in the Toronto bathhouses of 1981, a moment of crisis reveals how spatial dynamics are often inseparable from social dynamics. This juncture of conditions and identities best describes how I began thinking about the proposal physically. And then to transition a bit, though part of my thesis aims to critique the static linearity of normative maps and their repercussions of their considerations, I will begin with a standard quantitative mapping of the United States under the lens of LGBTQ rights and protections, specifically situated in the larger site of the Bible Belt. The lines are clear here, the gradients of queer intolerance are not so distinct. And many of these states have only adopted laws or changed laws within the past 3 years due to pressure from organizations like the HRC, and New York State was one of them. To shift towards less familiar cartographies, designer and queer researcher Lucas La Rochelle has created Queering the Map, a community-generated counter-mapping platform that digitally archives queer experience in relation to physical space. And one of the most impactful concepts that I took from La Rochelle's work on queer geographies is its stance on the indeterminate reality of intersectional spaces. So though maps are most often used to orient us, this digital archive of queer space resists the academic desire to make sense of the map and instead delights at the potential to get lost while navigating its interface. And that concept, paradoxically, is inescapably queer for many instances on the map. And they vary a lot in content, from great to not so great. And to turn now to specifically queering the map in Jackson, Mississippi, I will just run through a bit of site work and directly from the people that are there, since I am currently unable to visit. And this quote has gained very deep meaning for my project as it's progressed. Catechism classes include a series of fixed questions, answers, or principles relating to the Christian religion, often heavily interpreted, to be given in a question and answer format. And this mapping of a queer experience in Jackson relating to homophobia in a space that's meant for welcoming reads very clear in terms of this proposal. So to go back to Ferris Street, there are many urban bodies at play in the site, like the mixed density ecosystems, both built and living that I mentioned earlier. But there's also a strong sense of religion here in terms of physical presence, with a network seemingly already at play. And the context is mixed fabric, like I mentioned, with some urban disjunctions like a grassroots skate park just left of the site, and a handful of those dilapidated structures. And the historic record of developmental promise in the area that has been consistently restarted, invested, and failed due to socioeconomic struggles and questionable developer strategies has really had a large impact on how it's changed since the 1950s. And after I began designing on the site, I found an adjacent building directly next to the site that you'll see in a lot of the perspectives, called Lizzie's Takeout, that I assumed was just fast food. But as it turns out, it's a food joint, yes, but they're also heavily sanctified and often do community outreach in terms of food. And the quote on the Red Cross comes from the Bible and equates the Lord to a beacon of rest, which could take on more meaning. And the full extent of the project can be seen here. The three typologies are arranged strategically and are also phased to grow through the site without sacrificing the scale of their typology precedents. And the programming of each is more fluid than fixed, with abstract definitions relating to larger experiences. And as I dive into the programming, I think it's necessary to bring to light a quote by queer historian George Chauncey that I really agree with. And it says, "There is no queer space. There are only spaces used by queers or put to queer use." So I divided these into three: reclaim, restore, and reform. And for the site plan, you can see I've kept exploring the notion of the shimmer in these images through the inverted shadows and reflections and relational glow, hue color slippage. And then to speak a little on how the plan evolved, there's a sequence of spatial strategies that I used when queering the church. And in harmony with Chauncey's definition, I would agree that the most impactful form of subversion is not in the design of the space itself, but the occupation of it and all of its layered meanings. And a question that kept coming back to me that was frustratingly simple was who enters and how? And this shows a gradient diagram of two different passerby and their relation to the building's only main entry. In dotted blue is the everyman, maybe on their daily walk, who happens to pass by the site. Seeing a church elevation, bell tower, and likely open doors, they come in, see the altar, and leave having satisfied their curiosity. In the pink, however, is the actual intended audience of the proposal, those that do not fit under the heteronormative umbrella. This is their space in a world that's not designed for them. And in order to control this point of entry with nuance, the plan opts for a faux altar in which only those in the know are able to pass through, drawing on decades of queer coding. If you know, you know. And for plan level 1, similar mechanism of protection or filtering is at play. They're not meant to be traditionally normative like the first plans in clarity or convention, but rather act as evocative images only meant for those who have seen its interiors. And in this section, cutting through the armory and its 3 levels, a language of interiority and exteriority is built. And here you can see the ramped mezzanine, the lobby, multi-level exhibition or event space, the walkable roof, and hover baths that are accessed from it. And similar to the sections before, in the church section, light plays a crucial role. The section is actually what I started with in the design of the project, even before that querying plan, as I wanted to play with the traditions of the sectional church. I wanted to let the light sift in vertically more than horizontally through stained glass, flip the church more outward facing, and carry the geometry of the dome down into a stage pit, which runs below a non-traditionally descending nave. And now that the design's been elaborated on a bit, I want to shift back to performance and protection. I wanted to carry the queering out onto the landscape and use it as a kind of filtering protection mechanism as well. So a waterway flows from the coded entry through the interior exedra, recedes under the monastery, and reemerges to snake through the protected landscape to rest directly under the baths. And the sloped additions, adhering to and breaking the grid, offer more both visible and enjoyable protection depending on where it's existing in the project. And trees are used as the primary visual source of coversion, planted strategically to limit eyesight views and or signal coded entries like the one directly under the faux altar from the left street into the Excedra Gardens. And plantings such as flower beds, trimmed hedges offer flexible and ecologically architectural spaces for informal intimacy and even formal enjoyment. And now that all are at play, you can see that new modes of density and gradient filtering emerge. Creating a landscape allows for both formal and informal realities to take place, but under a veil of protection. Speaking of protection, I wanted to signal how like an iconic element, which is also the most vertical and by extent visible beyond the site, can be used and or subverted, the bell tower. So I imagine this bell/defense tower to operate as a kind of control tower or viewpoint. Here, 2 volunteers are manning the system and taking notes of some suspicious activity in the landscape. And once the suspicions are confirmed as threats, an audible alert is sent and data is taken for future protection against repeat offenders to the sanctuary. And branching back off of subversion and protection, I found it both helpful and challenging to imagine a social timeline of the project's construction and survival. So what may start as 2 community leaders identifying a need may turn into a concerted effort to make tangible change for queer populations. And as in any community, rumors are bound to spread as things start to happen. Target populations may begin to take note. And as programs get up and running, word is spread and protection must begin. Once the armory is constructed, a larger network may emerge and the landscape becomes its own kind of ally. And the complete processes of the proposal may begin to work holistically. This timeline is actually what inspired the start of this presentation and represents why I presented, or I guess performed, the project as I did. I used coded forms and architectural norms as if you were this board, and the gradient of covert versus overt was at its most extreme. So in order to get this kind of subversive proposal built, albeit as a theoretical suggestion, the subversion must extend to policy before the design is even rendered. So here's the full phasing timeline without coded or doctored information. And in the renderings at the beginning, I only wanted to show those parts of the project that were visible to everyone, most especially if I was presenting to a theoretical board. Speaking of renderings, this one had a bit of a signal as well. The man on the left in higher resolution is one of those passerby, and one of the 2 shrouded figures behind his view is pointing to the secret entry to a new sanctuary attendee. I wanted to use this image as the pivot point between the narrative presentations, as it is also the exact pivot point of entry into the project. Once we pass through the filter and into the interior, the sanctuary comes into focus. Here it's more or less serene, like a sanctuary you would normally associate with, but can also change aesthetics for a lecture or event, or even a rave where the pit can be used to full effect. And the pleasure gardens act as a kind of intermediary between external and internal, and exclusive and inclusive. The spaces here can be used for communicating, luxuriating, or loving. This exterior space can also at times be open to LGBTQ allies so that they may support and enjoy the proposal without infringing on a sacred safe space. And the gardens can also accommodate multiple agendas at once, a picnic and a reunion, for example, with gradients of privacy directly related to the landscape. It is not and or, but both and. And here you can see a turning point from the monastery to the armory, turning the corner both literally and figuratively from safe haven to defensive center, soft and hard, the curvature and the embrace of the space transformation. And for the interior of the armory, where light, shadow, and filtering take on new meaning, you can see the baths infecting the space. And as for the people that are in the armory itself, specifically ones occupying the workspaces on the first level, they are elected democratically as part of the sanctuary community and work together transdisciplinarily to collaboratively enact change in the vein of design and dispersion. There can be traveling plant events, live entertainment, or academic lectures, all centered around the designs that are produced within this defensive armory. And I'm going to end here with a theoretical design use of the armory that engages a transdisciplinary kind of querying. You can trace the life cycle of a seed here in 4 steps: get, grow, give, and grow again. In this example, the armory for design and defense is adopting a non-binary both and strategy. The designs here can be ecological, architectural, sociological, and begin building a coded network of safe spaces or rendezvous points that ripple far beyond the site. In this way, one can trace the life of a single seed through many hands, places, and processes until it finds its way home. And in this example, an ornamental tree, such as a cherry blossom, can become a coded signal for community, companionship, or safety beyond the site that comes from the site. Will you meet me under the cherry blossom tree? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tanner.
You've rendered us speechless, Tanner. Yeah, I'll jump in here because I've been working with you on this project a little bit over the course of the recent months, and I just want to say this is an incredibly powerful project at so many scales. I'm incredibly just blown away by your depth of research in your particular site. The reading of architecture itself as a coded practice, which, as we have talked about many times, architecture is a language. And so you're using that in a kind of double entendre way. And you're telling these stories and setting up a series of really convincing vignettes. I wish we had more time to, and I was looking at your slideshow to actually like read the little comic strips and these conversations that are being had in the neighborhood. And you've kind of thought about so many different varieties of scenarios on how the space would be engaged from the inception of it as an idea to getting it passed through an approvals board who may be hyper conservative, and how do you present this as as kind of uncoded as possible, or I suppose coded to conservative norms, and then once you reveal the inside, the kind of dream space that gets unrolled and revealed, and also thinking about how architecture is also a practice that links very closely to infrastructures of surveillance, which at current moments are generally disproportionately placed in marginalized communities, be it increased CCTV presence and over surveillance and policing in Black neighborhoods. And so you're literally subverting those notions with your architecture, with the tower, right? There's so many symbolic representations in your designs that I think we need another few hours to really sit with and let it sink in. So you have so much to be proud about there. I also want to just talk a little bit about how your representational strategies are quite, I don't know, this might have been just something you did intuitively, but it reminds me a lot, obviously with the sanctuary as a very clear representation of kind of hyper-rationalization, and you're literally polemically deconstructing this with your architectural operations of slicing and cutting. And it reminds, there's a commentary there on, non-binary, like gender as non-binary, kind of augmentations of the body itself and identity. And then to your visualizations, they have this kind of sensuous, like almost surrealist images, like your first the exterior, well, you're flipping through it really quick, but anyway, the exterior one where you're in your fortress, the kind of blank fortress walls, it looks a little bit like a de Chirico painting, and with these this eerie stillness and emptiness that conveys this sense of loneliness but also power. And aesthetically, in some of your other images, you're using a lot of really playful, almost contemporary surrealist rendering techniques. which makes a lot of sense because you're challenging existing power structures and status quo, like the surrealists who believed that the rational mind was rationally suppressed, was actually rationally suppressing the power of imagination. And so you're leaning into imagination and dream space. But of course, at the same time, like in the 30s and 40s, most male surrealist painters and artists were vocally anti-gay. But at the same time, most women and trans-identifying surrealists were identified with the queer community, particularly Tamara de Lempicka, if you know her work, is quite beautiful. So, particularly, your project really does situate yourself within both art and architecture in a trajectory of queer space and queer identity. And I think as a fifth year undergraduate project, it's incredibly powerful. So congratulations.
Yes, mind-blowing, Tanner, congratulations. I think, it's fascinating to go through all your project and how thorough you've been and how everything, makes sense to me, particularly at the end when you show some of these immersive images, with the little kids there being able to, I got to read some of those comments, in high school, all the insecurity, where to be, I think those are very important observations, not only architecture, but city-wise. No, so you have a very strong urban approach. In that sense, I think, as Jillian says, there are probably some criticizable aspects. To me, I'm just gonna focus on what maybe I'm more familiar with in terms of like form making and design and building and scale. To me, it feels like your material studies and the idea of the flickering, it could have gone farther in sense that when you look at your plans and sections, for example, everything is, this on that. There are gradients of colors, but in terms of architecture, walls, section, it's like, it's this or that. No, it's either blue and the flickering, I don't know if it's just, what's the light blue versus the dark blue? Is it material change? Is it lighting change? What's happening, in that sense? Because the wall is just a wall. The wall is not flickering or the effect, to me, it's more just graphic than actually spatial. But you can achieve it spatially. You can flicker space. You can make someone. I love the idea of that control of like saying certain kind of people will go into attract to this kind of things versus others that are not interested in shiny things will look away. And I don't know, I think that there is so much sensitivity from you from, at all the levels of the scale of the project that I would say, let's just try to see how this also occurs spatially, just naturally, I would say, without the artificiality maybe of light, maybe with material or color effect as well. But I feel like your physical models at the beginning and the layers of plexi and the lighting, not this one, I think earlier studies, could have moved a bit more. And my last comment, so I don't take all the time, is that the surveillance aspect. I'm a little bit questioning it because, so it's sort of an inversion. Like you are making of the other ones what they did of you, and I'm not sure that's the right solution. like, so could we think about something else that is not so direct as, okay, well, we're going to be surveilling, and anytime a bully comes, we are going to grab it. Like, I don't know what's the solution, but like, I'm not sure if just having a control tower is what you want to do, because you probably want to do something that shows a different sensitivity towards these issues, and so but fantastic. I would say congratulations, cheers.
Thank you.
Hi, Tanner. Congratulations on this amazing work. It's quite an experience, and I have to say, so as Tanner is in a studio a seminar that I'm teaching called Geo Actors, and I come into the critique today with some anticipation to see my students' work. So it's really exciting, and the comments already really spot on, and I hope I can contribute. I agree. The flickering and shimmering has always been this kind of, for me, the thinker that Tanner referenced, whose name is escaping me. What is her name again, Tanner? So we don't.
Kate Thomas.
Kate Thomas, extraordinary lecture. I recommend it for everybody. And the way in which she articulated this was really very special and unique, and also ephemeral. The quality of the thing that you're trying to get at is actually quite hard to chase, right? As soon as we start noting a shadow of our own selves, right, we're moving it, to try to study it. And there's something in that about it, right? That the ephemerality, it's like a butterfly on some level. I mean, and so as a pursuit, I feel it's incredibly worthy, and there is something very tangible that could come through, and it has to do with trees and different tree types and how light moves through a super dense canopy as opposed to one which has a lot of space in it. And I feel this idea was introduced in a reading that you did do from Julian Raxworthy about the Miller House Alley, but the source material from which he was referencing, this is why I had to get up and grab it, because Tanner knows I am surrounded by books, but I like the physical. And I'm sure, Christianna, this one you've seen before. It smells like mildew, but I'm still happy to have it on my shelf. It's a recent acquisition, but he really gets into the atmospheric qualities of different trees in a very kind of archival. It's a total modernist perspective on plants that's very strange. But what he does do really effectively, what architects are great at, is understanding the typological, how it starts to organize space, and then applying that kind of thinking to trees and things which behave so differently from walls, as you pointed out. For instance, a wall is a wall and it's not going to shimmer. I love that comment. I feel like if anything gets at the kind of distinction between the at least the materiality of architecture versus landscape, that does. And to that extent, maybe the the opaque and cartoony tree doesn't help. I love it aesthetically in terms of your overall plan here, but you might want to rethink that and perhaps investigate that, because you do start to get a kind of quality of light that would do some of those things. Of course, all of these things are extraordinarily difficult to capture in the context of a render. And so I like the idea of how the discourse really ties it together. I also thought the comment around things remaining separate between the blue and the pink is an interesting one to consider. And I'm not really sure. I'm still cogitating, and maybe we can talk about it more when I see you next week. But for me, I'm finding the way you queered the church really, really interesting. And the subtlety of the moves, very, very interesting. And then how this typologically appears, because when we first see the plan, for me, I was getting a feeling of a printed circuit board and a kind of an intelligence unit. And I'm just talking about my very, very first impression. And it suggests a much larger community than what it actually organizes it to that extent. The way a circuit board of a computer is like, this big, but it's organizing, more than we can conceive of in terms of information. And I'm wondering if that was latent here, because it's not something you talked about in terms of it's really the aesthetic of the plan that I'm addressing with that comment. I think it's intriguing. And from what little I know about Jackson, it's in Jackson, Mississippi, right? This would certainly need a reach beyond that particular place. But it also reminds me of something that my mother discovered I guess in the 90s. She started a battered women's shelter with a group of women. It was like a nonprofit that she got involved in. It was in a rural location. And at the time, they kind of opened their doors and turned on the phone line and thought, well, maybe nobody's going to call. And the phone was ringing nonstop. And so, there was a feeling when they started it, like, we're in a rural place, there aren't a lot of people, and maybe this is not something people need. And the absolute other was described, and it had to do, I don't want to equate LGBT and battered is mostly domestic situations, although they're, in terms of it being hidden and not having resource, not having community around, in their particular case, what they were dealing with. And so I wonder if this is like, I don't know, like a sort of a headquarters in some way to rethink even religious practice relative to LGBT. And then I did have questions about the Catholicism, because you brought that in terms of iconography and obviously the tenets of the religion. Is there a religion here? Is it a religious? Is it like an idea of the Unitarian where all religions are welcome? Because I feel also that it's borrowing from Islam and a lot of different typological architectures that start to organize different symbolic representations of God versus human and nature. Can you comment on that, Tanner?
Yes, so that's something that's very also difficult to navigate, but it would probably holistically be more in line with Unitarian. But that's also what I was trying to get at with the community actors diagram, just to sort of suggest that whatever this religion, for example, just one, might be, is not static, but could change democratically over the years, depending on the changing population of this community. And you were spot on with your reference of the shelter started in terms of when I was looking at the measurable queer population in the area, and how there's sort of a disjunction when related to the legislation relating to queer people. You were spot on with that knowledge that I'm hoping that this becomes a hub. And that was why the Armory became a design element, was to sort of radiate out from the site and connect with it. With smaller, more rural areas, because I come from a rural area, and we would view even a place like Jackson as kind of like a safe haven, more or less, as a city, just because there's more people and more diversity and more understanding. And so my hope is that this will become a sort of coded center like that, that has a less static definition of what the religion might be within the church, but will reach out and begin to invite these conversations on and beyond the site relating to that. I hope that made sense.
Definitely. No, it's really intriguing. I will say this too, that the manner of presentation was really profound. And when you ended on the image of the three humans inside I was confused, because I know what a wide-ranging intellect you have, and I knew something was up, right? And I'm like, why are we looking at plans? This is, I was really in there with you, and I was a little worried about you, honestly. So if I'm being really frank, and then you made a facial expression that I was like, oh my gosh, that is not good. And you paused, which was really important. And it was really powerful because it took me into what a feeling, frankly. It took me into an emotion of what that would be like, because your mouth went totally straight. And it made me feel like that is what it is to suppress. So there's something gestural. I don't know how to translate that, Christianna, the jurors, like, into architectural and landscape thinking, but it was a really moving and brave thing to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, that pause. So Tanner's been calling the beginning of the presentation, like the fake out, or and we were talking about, let's make it really uncomfortable, like convincing that, yeah, he's interested in light in a church. And then, yeah, let's pause and see if anyone starts to comment, and then unfold into the real value system. So that's great that you pick up on that. Yeah. All right. And yeah, I mean, I think it was clear too. So many conversations over the course of the year, but I think there's so much to mine in terms of, placing an armory next to a church and sort of the face value of, like, American culture and value systems. And I've been super excited that the project moves beyond architecture through the mechanism of landscape, that, like, the production of the armory. The armory is a landscape producer in terms of the seedlings and the trees, and then those forms get dispersed in an urban way throughout the city as meeting points, that, it goes to that, if you know, you know. So if someone's view, if a parent is watching your text and you're saying, hey, let's meet by the cherry tree, but that's a coded message about your identity that you haven't revealed. I think there's so much power in that. And, even diving a little bit further, I do agree with Cathryn that the fuller idea of the landscape plan is that there would be a series of formal trees on the front, much like the front and facing, let's say, like evergreens or something of that nature in that front. And then as you filter into the pleasure garden, it becomes more and more romantic. And so the image of romantic landscape types on this site and through the city are indicators of like spaces of acceptance and community, whereas more formal don't yield any of that information. So yeah, a lot of exciting things. So thank you so much, Tanner. Congratulations.
Thank you for your time.
All right, and we've got a whole number of fresh jurors. Welcome, Jeremy, Elaine, Andrea. Thanks for coming in. I think I've shared all the info, but if anyone else is here that I'm missed, I can reshare. We've got like the schedule on a Miro board, and then a little bit of background information on the research groups. And I've been sharing the presentations on our Google Drive, so if you want to reference past slides. But with that, I think we'll continue on. So the next presenter is Queena. Great, ready to go.